So, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. Today, we'll be having a really interesting topic about how to craft product messages for PLG startups. We have here Robert, co-founder of Fletch. He will introduce himself a little later on. So to start with, I will be the host this afternoon. I'm Andrea, and I'm the Junior Growth Marketing Manager at Product People. Prior to Product People, I had been working in marketing and business development, and right now I'm in charge of all the social media, PR, and content creation tasks related to Product People. So, what's Product People? What do we do? Basically, our mission is to help companies to discover and deliver great products faster. We have for the in-house product management, product managers acting as interims, and a community of more than 25,000 product managers. Sorry, I think here. Thanks. Sorry. So, our product managers do the unglamorous hands-on work of a product manager owner or product leader in an interim or frictional basis. That means in missions that last 3 to 12 months. We onboard fast, align teams, and deliver outcomes. So to start off today's meeting, we want to get to know you, and as an icebreakers, we have 2 questions. The first question is, what is your role level at your company? You will see the questions on your screen and you can feel free to vote in there. So for the first question, answer number A is junior entry level, B is senior mid-level, C is manager senior, and D is C-level. And for the second question is, what stage would you say your startup is in? Answer A is idea stage, figuring out what to build. B is seeking product market fit. C has some traction, progress towards product market fit. And D is in a growth stage for our product. So the questions are on the screen. Feel free to vote. Well, we will give some seconds to do it. Really excited to see what are the answers for the questions and how this crafts with talk today. So we have the results for the voting. For the first question, we will have a tier for junior, senior, and manager senior, 53% of in the first 3 options. Nobody is C-level in the room. And for the second questions, 33% has some traction, progress towards product market fit, and 67% is in a growth stage for our product. So that's our audience in Zoom today. So let's go with Robert. As I mentioned, he will introduce himself better, but today we have Robert Kaminski. He's the co-founder of Fletch PMM. And giving the stage to you, Robert. I will stop sharing my screen and you can start sharing yours.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me. Welcome everybody that's on the Zoom meeting as well as the live stream. As Andrea mentioned, I'm Robert Kaminski. I'm the co-founder and partner at Fletch PMM. Today we're talking about product messaging, specifically for product-led growth, which has its own unique challenges, as we'll get into here shortly. A little bit of background about Fletch and myself. We focus on positioning and messaging from a product marketing point of view for early stage B2B startups. And we've worked with over 50 startups. A majority of them are venture-backed, and primarily we're working with horizontal companies with a good portion of them taking a product-led growth approach. And so this is very aligned to the stuff that we're dealing with day in, day out, and I'm excited to share a framework that we put together around how to craft product-led messaging across the user journey, and also just call out some of the challenges and things that we see. And so before I go directly into talking about messaging, I want to take a step back and just highlight the importance of positioning and go-to-market. And the reason I want to do this is we work with, as I mentioned, lots of startups working on their messaging, and they come to us with a messaging problem, but 9 times out of 10, the core challenge they have is actually a positioning and go-to-market challenge that's showing up in their messaging. And so I want to highlight this with an example. And so what I'm showing here, if we look at these 3 companies, Slack, Discord, and Microsoft Teams, and then across the top here, we have what we call our messaging or positioning elements of product category features, target customer, alternatives, problem, and benefits. What this is meant to represent is if you were to look at the product roadmap and just really breaking down the features of these products, you would recognize that they're very, very similar. They essentially have the same features. And this is where positioning and go-to-market start to influence just about everything you do from a messaging standpoint. And even though they have virtually the same product, the tack that they're taking from a positioning approach brings them down very different avenues for the channels that they're going to leverage and the type of messaging that they need to create. And so if we look at a company like Slack, all by anchoring to a very specific ICP for how they were approaching their product-led approach, their product-led growth, they were messaging against, and when we talk about alternatives here, we like to call this the current way. And so what are people doing before using your product? And so for Slack, in a lot of cases, people were relying on email, Teams, and Skype. And so their messaging platform was really anchored in the idea of, man, these other products and systems, really poor user experience, they're clunky to use, and they're just not much fun. And so you could see how all coming back to positioning of like, what place did Slack want to have in the market influences how they would start to communicate to these different audiences. Same thing for Discord, going after a very different group. And so they talked about different challenges, different problems, and ultimately promising different things in terms of benefits. And so the focus of today isn't on positioning, but I want to highlight this. I'm going to touch again on it at the very end, is when you're approaching your messaging, make sure you're tuning into what you're doing from a positioning and go-to-market standpoint. Because a lot of times your messaging isn't landing because you have some challenges with positioning. You're either too broad or you aren't thinking about your target ICPs and how you should be communicating what your product does against a given situation. And so let's talk messaging. And we're pretty blunt about this over at Fletch because we work in it every single day. Many startups don't do so well with their messaging. There's a lot of reasons why. I'll start to allude to some of them as we get into some of these examples. And so I want to share, these are real hero sections of some of these very well-known and successful PLG companies. And if you are feeling confident, you can go ahead and try and guess what companies these are. But here's the first example: turn possibilities into plans. Blank empowers teams to build better products together, define ideas, align on decisions, and move work forward all in one place. Anyone have a guess or thoughts on what this product does, who it might be for? I mean, this is the message that this company is leading with if you were to visit their website. And again, a very successful company. We see this all the time with this very, I would call it ambitious and vague messaging. Our opinion on why this happens, especially with venture-backed companies, is they're raising money off of this big message. There's this huge TAM. There's all this opportunity. And so the message sort of has to coordinate and course correct to that. And fundamentally, when you start doing messaging in your go-to-market, we like to say that it's the inverse of your investor messaging. And so moving away from generic stuff like this and getting really specific and being clear on who you are is really important. So here's the first one. Here's the next one here. Again, pipe in if you think you know who the company is or want to take a stab. Another very successful PLG company here: connect everything, achieve anything. Ultimately broad here, using words like everything and anything are sort of trigger words for me when it comes to a messaging standpoint. It just tells me that we're not dialed in. This doesn't tell me anything about the positioning. It doesn't tell me who they help. Is it for me, the problem they solve, or even what the product is. It starts to allude to it, but it doesn't go deep enough. And so we see this kind of messaging all the time, especially with horizontal products. And often that horizontal kind of goes hand in hand with PLG. And then last one here, this is actually from a really well-known marketer, and I love his stuff. So I was surprised to see this on one of the companies he's worked with. "You're ready, now is the best time," literally sits as their leading message on the site. Really doesn't tell you anything. And on top of the fact that this play button here isn't actually clickable, you have to scroll down the page and go find a play button on the hero. And so these examples here, the reason I share them, they're not to bash any of these companies, they're very successful, is that it's very easy to get messaging wrong. And it really tracks back to no one's going to know the product you have better than you. And people forget that your customers don't know what you know. And so you have to work back through messaging in the way that they will understand it. And so now let's take this into PLG, because it gets worse for PLG companies. And the main reason for that is that there's no translator. And what I mean by this is when you have a salesperson or you're even doing live events like this, like we get to spend an hour together. And so I have plenty of time to get my point across, to talk about messaging, to talk about positioning, to show examples, just like a salesperson would. In PLG, you're relying on your product and the messages that show up in your marketing, that show up in your product, to do all of the hand-holding for the customer. And that's super tricky because salespeople, they can sort of bend the messaging and positioning, they can show examples, they get a lot of time, 10, 20, 30, sometimes an hour to spend with a prospect. They're gonna deliver that message and make sure it lands. PLG startups in particular don't have that luxury. And so we have to be very succinct when we're crafting PLG messages. And so how do we approach this ultimately? And this will get us into kind of the core of what I want to share today. And at the highest level, when you're thinking about your PLG messaging, think in moments and focus on clarity are the two most important kind of pillars that you can have when you're crafting messaging. And so what I'd like to do is take you through a model that we've been developing at Fletch specifically for PLG startups. Don't worry about capturing all of this. I can share the deck and we're going to walk through each of these steps one by one. And so the main thing here that I want to highlight is really this H2. It is about sequencing the right message at the right time. And so your user journey from awareness of like figuring out you even exist translates into, okay, you've got them into some message where you're trying to acquire them as a user, get them to sign up into the product. Then they're in your product and they need a whole slew of different messages to get them to the first aha and multiple aha moments, start to activate some of those habit loops. And then ultimately, as they activate and they're getting value from the product, you want them to expand that. That's really the core of any PLG, especially acquisition loop, to bring in more people in a multiplayer fashion. And then if your product's doing its job and your messaging is doing its job, this last bit here on monetization usually gets to be the easiest part where you ask them to pay. And as we know with PLG, all that value is delivered up front. So asking to pay usually gets pretty simple near the end. The thing here is all these messages are extremely different. As you'll note here, you're going to lead with something very unique for each step of the process. I know I'm showing this as linear. This is not always a linear process. There's a lot of work that has to be done to uncover how your product works, what you're doing from a go-to-market standpoint, and we'll start to unpack this. The last thing I'll add, and we're going to bring the Calendly example as well as a few others through this to make sure it hits home, and we'll hopefully spark some questions for everyone who's here by the end. But the other element to keep in mind is that with PLG, don't forget that oftentimes they're horizontal products, meaning there's lots of use cases, there's lots of different personas. And so these messages start to multiply. PLG has a huge volume challenge when it comes to messaging. And so I'll keep hitting on that as we go. And so first bit here, awareness messages. What are these? These are messages that get people aware that you even exist, to get them to start to consider that you might be able to solve their problem, and also introducing a component of your product. And so when we think about this, ultimately, you can think about this a little bit like demand generation. What type of stuff do you put out in your marketing, your thought leadership? And what we like to say, especially for PLG companies, is anchor to these struggling moments. You'll hear a lot of people say like, yeah, message on the problem, and that's good advice, but it doesn't go deep enough. Struggling moments are very specific. And this is counterintuitive for a lot of startups. There's this fear that if I go so specific, like if we take this Loom example, If we were to message, I just sat through my 5th meeting of the day, that could have been an email. Well, they get worried. Well, what if people don't even have 5 meetings that day? Like, that's too specific. I'm going to put off people who only have 2 meetings. And that just doesn't flesh out that way. People relate to specificity. There's this analogy in the music industry that you'll hear a lot of top artists talk about their most famous hits. Like, a lot of them are love songs, and they didn't set out to write a love song. They actually set out to tell a very specific story about their experience with love. And even if no one had that exact experience, they're able to relate to it. And that's what makes it so compelling. And so when you're doing this type of awareness messaging, the more specific you can be, you'll actually create this stronger signal for people to react to what you're saying, because it's just more visceral. So this is really, really important. And I have some examples here. We're not going to go through all of them, but being very, very specific on these struggling moments for awareness messaging. We use this quite a bit at Fletch in all of our content marketing, talking about the specific challenges that startups face. When we get their attention, you'll notice that also with that awareness message, I'm not really talking about my product at all. I'm just talking about what my prospect might be dealing with so that I can grab their attention. Then I bring them into these acquisition messages. And so if I can get their attention, essentially I've earned time. Sometimes it's only 10 seconds, but I've earned eyeballs on some additional message, either via click of an ad or a view of my content, or they're viewing my profile, or they're coming to my website. And so when we move to acquisition messages, the approach here is about being very clear about what your product capabilities are. And we'll talk about product capabilities here. So for PLG companies, less is more. There is this desire, for whatever reason, and all startups fall into this, but especially PLG and especially platforms that are building a lot of features. They think it's their goal when they bring someone into their world, usually their website, but it could be a piece of collateral. They think it's their job to explain everything the platform does. And that's a huge mistake, because no one's there to use the entire platform day one. This is why you need to link that problem back to a core capability. And what we like to say is lead with your most compelling capability, the thing that's going to get them in the door. And so this example here, if you're familiar with Panda Express, you could call it Chinese. It's kind of Americanized Chinese here in the States. If you ever go to one of these restaurants, there's always someone standing outside the restaurant with a sample platter, and orange chicken is the only thing on the platter. Even though they have a lot of stuff on the menu, the orange chicken is their best-selling product. And the thinking there is that if they can get someone to try the orange chicken, they can get them inside, and then they can show them the rest of what they offer. Very similar analogy for PLG companies. And so you really have to think about shrinking the message, that first message, and anchoring to capabilities. And when we talk about capabilities, it's not the features you have. So our definitions of these, the capability is the new thing that a user can do with your product that they can't do today. It's like the unlock. And it's very specific to what the product actually does. The feature is what powers that. And so there's this tendency sometimes to lead with features like, oh, we do video screen recording, or we do public channels. Like, that's fine, but what does it give the potential user? That's likely what you should be leading with on your acquisition messaging. And once you land that, then you can start to introduce, oh, and this is what powers it. And if you use it well enough, this is what it leads to in terms of a benefit. And for benefits, our definition of that is increase of something good or the decrease of something bad. And so the takeaway there for acquisition, be hyper clear, shrink your message, and lead with your core capability. And there's always time later to sequence and introduce other capabilities and features down the line. Okay, activation messages. So you've successfully hooked them in with your awareness message. You've convinced them to take the first step. And for PLG, that's likely they clicked sign up. And so you have their email of sorts, but then what do they see as soon as they come in? And so they haven't used the product yet. And so activation messages, they aren't always onboarding, but they are primarily onboarding messages. These are to bring people from that initial unlock capability into actualizing that. So think about it as the first aha moment. And when we think about these, so we'll just use Calendly as the example to bring in here. This is where you're taking that capability that you led with in your acquisition message and then walking it through for how the feature works, and more specifically, how they're going to use the feature. And so Calendly does a pretty good job of this in their flows with some things like the status bar, taking them through very clear steps. Similar to capabilities, shrinking these aha moments is really important. I'm sure you've all used a lot of products, and there's nothing worse than coming into a product and having this feeling of, what do I do? There's like 10 toolbars across the top. There's all these tabs on the left-hand side. I see this with a lot of products that essentially they're building their platform, but they don't lead me where I'm going. And so this is what's really important. When you get into these activations, this kind of goes back to understanding use cases. Something to think about when you're acquiring users is, can you bring them into a specific, who are they and what are they trying to do? Because it's likely, and Calendly maybe is more generic, but it's likely that when they come in, they're going to need a very specific flow. And for Calendly, in this case, they want you to book an event to bring that in. For Loom, they want you to record your first meeting. For Fathom, they want you to bring that recorder into your first call. And so you have to be really specific. And again, same principle applies. Keep this light, right? We're just trying to get them to some value quickly, not all the value. And so this is how we think about activation messaging here. Habit messages. And so these are, think of them as a continuation of activation. And so I'm making it through this journey. I've had some aha moments. So for Calendly, I've had someone book a meeting on my calendar. I'm like, wow, that's pretty cool. I'm not yet linked into the product, right? So when we think about building habits, this is where we start to translate to value and benefits. And this is counterintuitive, right? There's a lot of marketing advice out there that you'll notice that benefits, we're on the fourth step. A lot of marketers out there will tell you, lead with benefits, right? Like if I'm Calendly, tell them I can save you X minutes booking meetings and all that. Like, what we find is that's just not very effective for PLG. People, especially since they want to get their hands on the product, it aligns to how you're self-serving. Benefits come in this later moment. But people get benefits wrong. And the way they get them wrong is by levels. And so if we walk out this Asana example, I think this will really hit home. Benefits, in our view, should connect directly to what the product does. What you see on 90% of startup messages is they overpromise. I would say over half of the pages I go to and even in-app messaging is like, sell more deals, increase revenue, like all these big things. We call those second, third, fourth order benefits because you have to connect the dots all the way to that value. And so for Asana is a project management tool, essentially. Lets you manage all your tasks in one place. If they were to message on increased revenue, there's this huge gap between, wait, I'm managing all my tasks in one place and my revenue goes up. BS. Prospects and users are very skeptical of this, and it puts the burden on, well, how do you do that? And so you want to walk this out of, well, it keeps your team more organized. It'll allow you to ship more features, which will increase customer happiness, and it'll increase retention and word of mouth, and then it'll increase revenue. And so what we say when communicating and messaging on benefits, message closest to the product. Asana is much better off promising keeping the team more organized. And if they can quantify this, all the better. When we think about it back into our PLG model here with habit messages, Calendly does a pretty nice job of this. Fathom does a nice job. If you can tie the value back to the aha moments, and so I'm a Fathom user, or actually Loom does another good job at this. So I'm a big Loom user, and I get these reports sent to me sometimes in email that says, hey, you've eliminated 3 hours of meetings this week. That's them highlighting the value that the product directly gave me this week. And it starts to trigger me of like, wow, that's great. I want to build on that progress. That message only lands if I got to the first aha, like I'm actually using the product. If they were to hit that to me in the beginning of like, hey, you could reduce your meetings by 4 hours, it's just not as effective. I'm not there yet. I haven't even used the product and they're making these promises. And so habit messages, leading with benefits and keeping it really close to the product is really important. And again, the idea is to create some of that habit loop flow to highlight the value. And so expansion messages. So these are, by this point in time, I'm a pretty good user in the product, right? So when we think about sequencing these, like Calendly, I'm using the product, I'm getting the value, habits are starting to form. One of the biggest benefits of PLG is related to PLG acquisition, where the product actually gets you additional users. And so these types of messages really bring in that multiplayer element. And what happens here from a messaging standpoint is you're sort of repeating the sequence of acquisition messages just at a different level. And so for Calendly, now they're trying to convince me to bring my team into the play, trying to say, hey, book meetings with your sales engineer. So this is assuming I'm a salesperson in these examples here of lead with. And so when you do these capabilities, so this is kind of hitting on the same fundamentals. This goes back to specificity of product, a problem that we did with the awareness messages. The more specific you can be, the better. And so this is where you have to do a little bit of diligence in your product to see how people are using it. What are the roles? And then let's kind of walk out the sales one. Let's say I am this user of Calendly. I've been using it a while. And this is actually more for Loom, but add a personal touch to your cold emails. If they wanted me to get the level up of this, they could start to bring in some multiplayer messages of like share updates with your VP of sales, right? And so this is where I'm still the same persona, but I'm moving into a different use case. And the same principles apply. Be very clear on the capability. Don't overpromise. You can even allude a little bit to the problem here, but this is where you start to expand the footprint into those multiplayer use cases. And then finally, values being achieved, right? In these monetization messages, I know it shows as linear. These can happen after you've built habit loops, but often are more effective, especially when you're doing PLG and even moving into PLS, where you're trying to move into account level type value messaging, is hitting them to pay. And this is kind of an ask, right? And there's all sorts of ways you can do this tactically in PLG, setting up certain thresholds and reminders. The way you think about leading here is to think about scaled capability and then just being very explicit. And it's counterintuitive to a lot of sales messages that happen that aren't PLG is I've already experienced a ton of value. And so my experience is like I use for Fletch, we probably have 20 or 30 pieces of software that we use. Many of them take a PLG approach. A lot of them we started using for free. By the time they ask us to pay, it becomes a no-brainer. And so the name of the game for those last ones is just being very, very clear and specific. What do I get and how much is it? I already believe in the product. I'm already a user. I'm already activated. So don't go too crazy and broad with your message. That scaled benefit should be very close to the product, just like we did with the first one. And Calendly does a nice job with this of exactly what I get out of this. And as a matter of fact, I'm a paid user of Calendly, and I definitely followed the freemium model for them as I became an acquired user. And so that's the model, and you guys can go unpack that a little bit of how we think about sequencing those messages. I want to come back with a few additional things and touching back on positioning and go-to-market. And the reason I want to hit on this, and I was touching on this as we were going, is with a lot of PLG products, they're horizontal in nature, hence the self-service. They can be used in these different ways. This isn't always the case, but where people get this wrong in their messaging is they try and message at the company level. And so when we think about a company like Airtable, who took a PLG approach and is horizontal, they don't have a single fit with a market. The reality is they exist in many different markets. And so when you see this breakdown, ask yourself with your companies, is this similar to what you guys see with who you message to? Are there different company types, different personas, and different use cases that are out there? If there are, that should be a trigger to you that you likely need very specific messaging flows inside that model that I shared to gain awareness, acquire users, activate them, and bring them all the way through the value chain. And I want to highlight on this, this is expensive in terms of resources, time, and energy. It goes back to my comment of PLG messaging being this big volume challenge. There's a lot of messages to create. And so be very aware of who you're actually going after. To hit this home, finally, this is my visualization of how I look at horizontal markets. And I think many people miss the boat on this. We think on the left-hand side in terms of, oh, I raised money, I have a big TAM, and then there's this smaller set of people in my SAM that I'll eventually get to. And then there's this targeted group in my SOM. I see a lot of investor decks for startups. They have this slide. It's great for raising money. But when they go to actually tap into that market, markets are messy. They're messy because they're made up of humans with irrational behaviors that are scattered across contexts and different industries and different things that they're trying to do and different budgets. You can slice up markets in all these different ways. And when you start to look at markets like the visual on the right, it's going to start to trigger for you, how do we be specific? And so what I hope it starts to provoke, going back to some of the challenges we saw with these companies messaging and with those early examples, try not to be broad. There's a place for being broad. Sometimes it's your homepage, but when you're bringing people in through your product, think in terms of specificity, in terms of context, because the good message is the one that hits at the right time, at the right level of detail for them to actually resonate and come through. And then the last bit here, because Fletch does focus on website messaging, wanted something for you guys to take away. When you're thinking about doing this, and I kind of touched on this on the last slide, here's a proposed site structure for PLG startups. In our opinion, and this will depend a little bit on the stage that you're on, our opinion is that your homepage should be catered to your highest value ICP. There's an argument to be made that you could level up this messaging a bit to be a little bit broad. And that's fine if you're growth stage and beyond. But if you're early, I noticed through the poll that there's a lot of folks who are working through product market fit and are trying to turn on growth. Your homepage is a really important piece of real estate. Use it where it's going to be the most valuable by putting the main use case. Even some of the most successful horizontal and PLG companies, if you look at even Loom's site and Calendly's site, I use those examples throughout. Even though they have somewhat of a broad message, when they get to the layers of specificity, they lead with sales. It's their number one team that they go after. And so that's what you want to be using for your homepage. These solution pages, think of these as the landing pages. And we're pretty bullish on, in a lot of cases, in your demand gen and your marketing, not to bring people to your homepage at all. Bring them to the specific page, because nothing's going to resonate more than that very specific message. And let them work back to the homepage. Let them say, oh, wow, this is how you would help me in sales. I'm a salesperson. What else would they do? Let me see what the platform's about. I'll go to the product pages. I'll go see what they do for marketing. And then another element here, enterprise. We see this a lot. And so PLG, almost by definition, you're messaging to the user. And so we get that eventually when you're going to monetize, you have to message to these director, VP, C-level and above to get them to actually pay for your service. That happens later. And so on the website, I would say it's something to de-emphasize. You're going to be messaging to the people who are using the product. If you want to carve out a space, create an enterprise page, and that's where you'll speak a little bit more to the company level problems, the executive level problems. They're not going to bring in users because for PLG, that's just not the way. But a lot of times we'll see that there's PLG placed into a standard sales-led approach as well. So there's room for that. And then the last bit, be clear on your call to action. If you're doing PLG, it gets really awkward when you're doing half and half of try the product, get a demo, talk to a sales rep. We see a lot of weird things happen with CTAs. And so if you really are between different growth models, find different pages where you're bringing people through those different paths. And so with that, I appreciate everyone joining. I hope this model was helpful. I know we've got some time here to talk through questions of anything I've shared or even specific challenges that you all are facing in your own startups with messaging.
Thank you, Robert. That was really interesting, really insightful. So right now I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay. So while Sagar collects the different questions from different platforms, I will be introducing a little bit more product people to give, the audience some time to gather their thoughts and wrap them around. And then we will go with a Q&A. So as I mentioned before, Product People, we're a company that is focused on product management and an interim/fractional basis. And these are some of our most used cases, aka when to engage with us. The first one is as interim/fractional product managers or product leaders, as I mentioned before. And this can work for permanent position covers, like while you're hiring, when your company is hiring, as it often takes 3 to 9 months for every product role. Then parental leave covers of 3 to 12 months, and important and urgent initiatives like driving product discovery and delivery, or meeting a deadline, or creating a big impact in 3 months. Then the second use case is as product coaches or consultants or program managers/product operations. We can coach your product management team to appraise the skills and set up like personal development plans. And we can create and streamline processes and programs. And the third use case is for product discovery, like for example, running a low or no code pilot slash MVP or discovering the next impactful initiative. This is what we do, and now what we are not doing. As mentioned, we are not recruiters and we won't source candidates. We're really happy to share your role with our community for free, as mentioned before, and we can help appraise candidates, but we are not recruiters. We're also not a freelance marketplace, which means that the Pro People team is full in our payroll, and we join after completing 7 steps recruitment process. We also run like 360 feedback sessions every 1 to 3 months per company. So we are all on the payroll and we're not freelance. And last but not least, we're not a development slash design agency, which means that we specialize in interim product management, coaching, and discovery. And if you need developers or designers, we're happy to introduce you a few reliable firms that we work with. So here you can see some of our B2C clients such as Zalando, Tier, Scout24, Deep Backmarket, Douglas, and Blinkist. And here are some of our B2B clients like Utopia, Pliant, the World Health Organization, Remote.com, Eternal Health. Here you can read some of the positive feedback that we had from our clients, like bringing a lot of momentum in the whole programs, big efforts, loving the flexibility of the team, and blazing fast onboarding. And here you can see some of our stats. We've supported more than 200 cross-functional teams and more than 70 clients from Series A startups to publicly listed companies. We are around 40 product leaders and product managers, Pro People in-house and full-time, and 60% of women in the team, 66% in leadership. Well, here you can watch us all. And just as you know, we are hiring, we are looking for some positions. You can always go to our LinkedIn jobs posting, and then from there you will see our open roles. So now for the actual Q&A, let's see which questions do we have. Okay, from YouTube, we have what actionable frameworks can be used to create impactful product messages for PLG startups?
I think, I mean, the one that comes to mind would be the one that I shared, kind of taking you through. I think what's tricky about this too, in even the steps that I've taken them through, you need to adapt them to your situation. And this goes back to, this is why I brought go-to-market into the fold. You really need to start to consider the channels that you're activating, your positioning in, and where you're placing some of these messages, because it's not going to adapt the approach that I brought with whether it's bringing capabilities or messaging on problem first when you're doing awareness, but it's going to tell you how to match the medium with your message. And probably the cleanest example of this, there's a lot of talk of content and messaging repurposing out there. I think that's kind of a dangerous concept. At least that's what we believe at Fletch, because each medium has its own style, flavor, expectations of messaging. And so even when you do an onboarding message versus a social post for awareness to what you put on your website, it's all going to really depend on the type of people you're bringing through. And so I know that's a little bit vague and abstract, but in terms of a model that I'd recommend, like really think through those stages of awareness that I brought you through and start to adapt those into your environment to what makes sense is what I'd recommend.
You're on mute.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, sorry, I was drinking water. I think we have hands up from Gaurav in Zoom.
Yeah, hi. First of all, Robert, thanks. It was very, very insightful. Really enjoyed it. So my question is, in case you are operating in different geographies, sometimes you need to cater your messaging to the individual tastes and the cultures and the individual habits and the local context as well sometimes. So what's your take on it? I mean, I'd love to hear, how you've
Yeah,
operated in such, in such models.
for sure. First off, thank you for the comment on the presentation. I appreciate that, and your question as well is really an interesting one. To me, it comes back to, and this gets interesting. Perhaps we do a lot of work here in the States, but in Europe, I know with the diverse set of cultures and languages that are out there, you're spot on that you do have to adapt. What I would ask you to consider is, in this, again, baking back to go to market and positioning, when you're thinking about messaging, it depends on what level of maturity your startup's in. Do you need to be in all of these countries is the first thing I would ask. Because very similar to what I mentioned around different use cases and different personas, there's this extra effort to translate culturally a message that's going to resonate for these different languages. And so we saw this, we worked with a company that was based in Latin America, and we were working on their messaging together and what they were going to do for their website. And it was actually quite an interesting exercise where we would develop messaging that was really clear, aligning to some of the principles that I shared today. But they would check us on this, right? And this is why it's really important to have people really close to the customers that you're going after. In their case, they were based in Latin America. And so even when we created this message, what we found is that there was this, not dissonance, but the way we might communicate something here in the States in English would be very different than the expectations for Latin America. And being more specific, they were going after the banking industry. And they told us that in Latin America, like, being very aggressive with your messaging is sort of a turnoff. And so we got to this really interesting point where they had this clear message of what we wanted to communicate, what the product did, but they had to tone it down for their geography to make it work. And so I don't know if I 100% answer your questions. I think if the summary of my takeaway is you definitely have to adapt. And where I would place caution is if you have this international go to market where you do need to translate these messages, just make sure that you have the resources to support it, because that effort can be pretty significant and often overlooked, where you think, oh, the message is done, let's just translate it and ship it out there. And to your point, you might be putting a message out there that's just not going to land culturally or with the language barrier. I appreciate the question.
Thank you. Thanks for that. And I don't know if I might just add my comments as well to that, because
Yeah, that'd be great.
I mean, I was handling go-to-market as well for a large corporation, and in fact, a similar example as you suggested and I have this example between Latin America and Asia, and on the other hand, Europe, which was Netherlands at that point of time, the market that I was leading, where in Latin America and Asia, we were really looking at demographics, age group 20 to 40 really as the primary target user, whereas in Netherlands, which we were targeting, it was primarily the age group of 60 plus, union workers,
wow.
Those who had never used smartphones and what have you, So the messaging completely changed, from one, context to another, where we were at one place, really toning it down and kind of dumbing it down, for lack of a better word, to kind of convey our messaging. Whereas on the other hand, we were conveying all this, the nice features and all of that. On the other side, we were dumbing it down just to say, okay, just touch this button and it does everything for you, so to speak. So
well, and you said something interesting too, and this is important for folks listening, is when the demographic shifts slightly because the message is watered down, you made the comment, well, they don't use smartphones. And so you're actually telling me that the medium of the message is going to change. And so even where you place the message, the channel or the device, when that updates, you suddenly have less real estate. The message has to either shrink or grow. The platforms are different when you cross countries. Some countries might be really heavy LinkedIn users. Others might be using a different social for getting some of this information. And so it gets really nuanced really fast. It's interesting to share. You mentioned you're at a larger company. Do you feel like you have the resources to support those different pieces, or is it kind of a messaging overwhelm situation that you have trying to cover all of that?
No, so it was very, very targeted. We were really targeting some very specific markets where we knew that there is, certain demand, and which is why we targeted, for example, Netherlands or Sweden, where we knew that there's a distinct gap and we could enter that market. So yes, so it was very, very, so rather than targeting the entire, Western Europe or Central Europe, we really said, let's target this particular country because we can identify with the demographics there. So yes, we did have the messaging. And to come to your point, yes, given that some of our target users in the Netherlands were really 60-year plus union workers, there was a lot of reliance on non-digital messaging as compared to digital messaging, and that twisted the entire story. So our entire marketing investment and investments in the messaging were really in terms of which channel are we targeting, digital versus non-digital, actually. So it was, I mean, I could get into a case study on that, but that's the short form of it.
Thank you for the chat in this, Gaurav. This just hits home that, again, when you run into a messaging challenge, track it back, because it likely is a go-to-market or a positioning challenge in disguise most of the time.
Yeah. Thank you.
Great. That was a really interesting discussion. I think we have a hands up in Zoom, Alfie.
Hi, Robert. Thank you for the great presentation. I'm curious if you're able to reveal which examples you had shown us. You said they were successful brands, and I'm just wondering if you can divulge there.
Yeah, I can. Andrea, if you let me, I think you may have to come off share. I can bounce in here. Yeah, I think you'll be surprised by the first two. Let's see. And we did, so it's interesting too. One of these companies, we wouldn't say we bash them often, but we share their, the second example I'll share, they finally did change their messaging. And so this first one here, this is Figma's FigJam product. When you go to their page, I'm not sure if it's still up, but they are trying to articulate that they are a digital whiteboard product for product teams to do collaboration, Miro-esque. In fact, if there's a second here between the next question, I can bring up a rewrite that I did for FigJam to show you kind of the contrast difference. And so I'll dig for that in a second. So FigJam was this first one. This one here is Airtable. And the thing about Airtable now, and it is kind of easy to poke at them, they've solved for clarity of their messaging in different ways. So they're very successful now. They can get away with these very aspirational messages. And that's another thing. And we even call this out. We use a lot of big names in our models to share our frameworks, but we add the caveat that be careful mimicking too much of what these already successful companies are doing, because they're simply at a different phase. And so did this actually impact their growth for what they're doing today? Probably not, because they're bringing people in through one of their very specific doors, those landing pages where they say, hey, we're specifically for marketing teams running campaigns. That's the message they're going to resonate on. But this one's Airtable. And then this one here, I believe, is Alt MBA, which is kind of a different approach to business school and even kind of almost like a product school in that regard. So those were the examples we had there. I hope it's interesting.
Great. I hope that solves your question, Alfie.
Yep, but that was great. Thank you very much.
Thank you for being eager to ask. We have another question from YouTube, from Lars. Can you say a couple of more words about discovering your messages and positioning, or the process you use to discover it?
Yeah, I can. It's a pretty deep topic, but at a simplistic level, when we bring startups through our program and we start helping them with their positioning, the first thing we do is we actually evaluate go-to-market. And so we ask 3 questions to them. We ask them, what types of companies are they going after? Because we're usually working B2B. What types of teams, personas, and roles in the companies are they trying to communicate with to get them into their product or into a sales call? And then we ask them about use cases. And when even those 3 things, and it gets really interesting, we throw all of this into a board where we say, okay, you're going after these type of companies, these types of roles, and these types of use cases. And we start to sort of decompose what the messages need to be. And there's a multiplying effect. When you think about adding those elements, right? So let's just work through an example. If you're going after, let's say, a healthcare company in a marketing team doing campaigns, that's a very specific use case. And ideally, you'd want to start crafting messaging for those folks. So you can imagine creating, and we end up doing a lot of web page and landing page messages. So you could see a page that says, hey, we are the product for marketing teams at healthcare organizations doing X, whatever that use case is. And we show that to them. And then we kind of ask them, what does this look like versus how you message today? And what we usually see is they're at that super broad level. They're either messaging across a broad use case of like, yeah, we're running campaigns, like we're the product for running campaigns. And when you look at that on the surface, it's just not going to resonate. And so when we talk about positioning, a lot of times it's tracking back to who do you serve. One of the things that we believe in is your product strategy is just the kind of the inverse of your go-to-market strategy. And so an unlock a lot of times for these founding teams, and something to kind of ask yourselves and your internal teams is, who are you building for? And this will tell you quite a bit about your organization. It'll tell you whether you're building a product from a technology perspective, or you just building cool features and then going to see who wants them, solution in search of a problem. That can be a little dangerous. Are you taking a problem approach where you've identified this really big problem and you're just breaking that down? That'll take you down some paths that hopefully will get you to like, oh, these types of people have that problem. We see some folks that come to us and say, hey, we're just really passionate about helping account executives. And it's like, okay, you're focused on account executives, and then you can work backwards to the problem. And so there's these different vectors. We call them positioning anchors. And those really represent the elements even that I introduced in the model today. And so we run this diagnostic, and then we just simply ask them, like, who are you building for? And the second question we ask is, where do you think your growth is going to come from for the next 3 to 9 months, sometimes 3 to 6 months? Because one thing people get wrong about positioning, especially founders, is there's a huge fear to pick a position. Because when you pick a position, you're effectively deciding not to pick 100 other positions. And that's really scary for product teams. It's really scary for go-to-market teams. It's especially scary for founders because they think they're pigeonholing themselves. The reality is, if you don't start to select and even narrow a little bit, you're going to resonate with no one in your messaging. Your traction is going to be really difficult to come by. And so that's how we approach it. It's really like, what are you building and why are you building it? Trying to get to essentially a who it's for, or at least a point of view of how we should be explaining the product to take up the space in a market. And then once we have that, assuming you do it pretty well, reverse engineering out the messaging gets easier when you're specific. Like any good writer will tell you, like, write like you're writing to an individual. And the bad examples that I showed you in these messages, they're not writing to an individual, they're writing to everybody. And so messaging comes last. It really is. And I simplified it. There's a lot of variables in there as well, of like, what kind of company you want to be, what kind of product you want to be, what kind of founder you want to be, what kind of product leader you want to be. We can't answer those for them. It's really, you have to answer them. And then when you answer them, go try it, right? Don't be afraid to pick a position, try it for 3 months to test whether there's actually traction. And then you can always reposition. The big example we always give is when Amazon started. Even if Jeff Bezos said, I want to be this marketplace for everyone, that's not how he positioned and messaged. He started by saying, I want to be the largest bookseller. Like, he just picked one very narrow thing. And then he went from books to media. He added CDs and DVDs, right? So the position evolves over time. And so I hope that's helpful, but it's really just a diagnostic of what you're building, why you're building it, and who it's for, and then breaking that down into what the market actually looks like and how you should start approaching it.
Thank you for your answer. Now on to the next question.
Andre, before that, can I just interject and add something to what Robert said? It was very interesting. If you don't mind, yeah. And Robert, just to add to what you said, when we're looking at B2B, essentially, you are really looking at a multiplier effect of messaging out there, because really you're looking at, an economic, influencer. You're looking at a user influencer. You're looking at an executive sponsor and a few other personas as well in a B2B context. So within a B2B space itself, you're really looking at multiple messaging, or whether it's of acquisition, activation, but at a multiplier effect within the same target industry, if you will. So
Yep.
that's yeah.
And
yeah.
I'll add one extra flavor that's
Yep.
you're gonna go, oh shit, there's a lot more. Personas in B2B. And so you brought up the industries. You have to message the low person, very different, the actual user, very different than the team manager, very different than the director,
Absolutely.
very different than the VP. And we see it all the time, is like there's an emphasis to just like jump right to the end.
Absolutely.
ROI value. And like when it comes to PLG, we, at least at Fletch in our approach, we believe that that's just flawed. You're not going to get the right time with that audience. And so, yeah, it's definitely a volume challenge for sure. Andrea, actually, before we jump to the last thing, would I be able to share there, just on that FigJam, I did find the example of a rewrite, and I think it'd be interesting for people to see how we approach rewriting some of those poor messages.
Yeah, right. Sure. I can stop sharing my screen.
So here is the one we looked at for FigJam. And so I actually took this and I ran it through our messaging elements. So all the things I introduced: problem, capability, benefit, features, target customers. And I rewrote their hero for them. They have not updated it, which is totally okay with me. It's more of a thought exercise for myself. But this is what I would call a more clear message for FigJam. And it's leading with capability. What is the main thing FigJam lets you do? It lets you work on planning and design in the same place. That's the product unlock. And then being very clear on what is it? A digital whiteboard for product teams. And then the feature is that it's baked right into the design tool you're already using, Figma. And then I allude to the problem: no more switching between apps to collaborate with other departments. This is how I would rewrite FigJam, so that when I bring someone into this and I'm really connecting all of those elements, and in fact, that's kind of the visual I have here, which I lost their hero message, but they didn't tell you who it was for. They just said teams. They didn't mention the problem. They didn't tell you it was a digital whiteboard. They just said single platform. And then their capability were these very vague term possibilities into plans. And so being clear, right? Shrinking the message and not making it sound so sexy. Like there's a real desire for people to do this, and I don't know why. They want it to sound good. Sounding good should not be your litmus test. It should be, does anyone get it? And can they explain it to a friend or colleague in a way you would want them to explain it? And so sorry for that caveat. I just thought it might be interesting for folks to see that.
Yeah,
it's clear over clever. Really. Marcus hit it. I love that.
It was really interesting to see how you redesign the message. I think we have a couple more questions. That would be all. We have a question from Jamie from YouTube that said, does PLG messaging guide change when someone is recommended a product by another person? And does it circumvent the steps or add more?
It can, yes. I would say even that word of mouth message there's tactics, and this will depend a little bit on your product and what the multiplayer looks like. There's this concept called billboarding, and Calendly does a pretty brilliant job at this. When you book a meeting on someone's Calendly, they subtly like billboard themselves. And they used to do this, but even in the booking link, they had a small little question in there of like, would you want to book meetings this way? And so that's where you get sort of, that one's a little different. It's not directly word of mouth, but that's where you're activating those expansion messages that I talked about. And so when you think about word of mouth, folding that in, and virality of word of mouth is really important for PLG. The way that you enable that, and this goes back to clarity. Do you have a way to give your current users the verbiage to explain it to someone else? In fact, this litmus test, my partner Anthony and I use this a lot. We always say, how would you describe it to a friend? That's a great test on all of your messaging. Of like, would you use this language to describe it to a friend? And what you find is that those conversations are very different. And if there's ways to even observe people doing that live, you're going to uncover a lot of things. And so even if you take something like Airtable early on, right? They really struggled with their messaging early on. They started with like organize everything, and then they eventually got down to these very specific messages, despite the one that I shared with you today. If they were to listen in how people were describing them, and they eventually did follow this, people were like, well, it's like a easier to use database, or it's like an Excel spreadsheet on steroids. And like that messaging, they ended up using for a long while. And so conversational messaging of word of mouth is something to think about. And I would say, to kind of close that question, because it's a good one, use the messaging that's clear, that people would use in those natural conversations, because that's what the first thing they're going to say anyway when they try to translate it. But the short is that it can circumvent some of those steps to walk through. Absolutely.
Great. As for the last question, it's here on Zoom. It says, I would ask Robert, if your awareness and acquisition messages aren't working, what can you ask yourself to tackle this without completely rethinking your existence?
Can you restate the question, Andrea? I didn't quite catch the beginning.
Yeah. If your awareness and acquisition messages aren't working, what can you ask yourself to tackle this?
Yeah. Especially with awareness messages, it's a really tough one, and it's a hard one to hear when you're working on product teams. It's an evaluation of, are you working on a problem that anyone cares about? Ultimately, a lot of those demand gen, those awareness messages are going to be anchored in the situations that your prospects are in. And if no one's reacting to them at all, it's one of two things. You're not being clear in the message, in which case you can run what we would call like a message clarity test. And the way you might do that is throw up one of your problem messages or whatever you're using in your content marketing, get someone in a session like this and just say, hey, read this message and then tell me what you think it means, just to check if they're getting the point that you're trying to make in your awareness message. If it is clear and no one's resonating, that's a signal that you may be working on a problem that just no one cares about. And that means either it's not frequent enough, it's not severe enough. It's, that's where we start to get into vitamin over painkiller situations. And that's definitely more of a product thing of like, are we working on something that matters? When it comes to the second piece, acquisition messages. Acquisition, I think I'm still here. Sorry, my audio cut out. When it comes to acquisition messages, very similar approach. When we usually work with people to do their website messaging, we tell them to do that message clarity test because it's really tricky, especially for PLG. You're using oftentimes these landing pages to convert people. And so you could put the message out there and say, hey, is it converting? But what you should do first is say, hey, does anyone get it? Because you're really testing two things when you're testing conversion. Do they get it? And then do they care? And so we would say, isolate those two variables, send out essentially that hero message that I was showing. And there's some tools to do this. Usability Hub has a pretty cool feature called like the 5-second test, although I usually do it for 10 seconds. Put your hero message in front of an audience, and it's like through a link, and ask them two questions. How would you describe this to a friend? And is anything confusing? And they'll tell you whether your message is clear. And then once you know the message is clear, then run your acquisition test of like, are we converting at a rate that we think we're converting? The second test will tell you, is really a value prop test. Does anyone even care what you're building to solve this problem? The first one tells you whether your message is clear, that message clarity test. So very similar principles, kind of working through those two, and that's how I would approach them.
Great, that is really, really insightful. That is actually our last question. So thank you everybody for joining. Thank you, Robert, for being here with us and sharing your knowledge generously. And well, see you in the future community events. Check our LinkedIn to see the upcoming events, and hope to see you again, Robert, too.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate everybody joining. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn if you have any follow-up questions.